Hi, and welcome to this workshop where we want to discover how our lifestyle influences our health. My name is Dr. Heidi Schulz. I grew up in South America, primarily in Argentina, and I have been living the last years in Germany, where I also work in human genetics. But this is not what I want to talk about today. Today I want to go in a journey with you to discover how our lifestyle influences our health. So let's begin by looking at what effect our lifestyle has. We have this recommendation that pure air, sunlight, abstemiousness, rest, exercise, proper diet, the use of water, and a trust in the divine power. These are the true remedies. But do they really work? Do they really help you stay healthy or get healthy? Let's analyze it from another perspective. Studies done by big corporations who have looked at thousands of informations from different sources, and they have calculated what factors and to what percent determine our health. So the bigger categories are individual behavior, environment, medical services, genetics, and social circumstances. Now I will leave you for about 30 seconds for you to think which category you think belongs to which piece of the pie that's represented on the graph. And let's see if you can match everything correctly. So 30 seconds for you to think about what factors are the biggest determinants of our health. So you want to see what the solution is? Well, this is what it looks like. Individual behavior has the biggest impact on our health, with about 36%, followed by social circumstances with 24%. That means that 60% of our well-being has to do with our decisions and our surroundings and what we experience in life. After the 60%, we have the influence of genetics, what we have inherited, but that accounts for only about a fifth of the total of our health and well-being. And having access to good doctors and medical services contributes with 11%, followed by 7% of the environment. So we see that our behavior and decisions have an influence on our health. And when we look at life expectancy, usually at your age, you don't see much difference. It's like the Jenga game. You begin taking pieces out of your tower, and you can take pieces for quite some minutes and nothing happens. Your tower stays upright and in a good condition. The same thing is with our health. Usually you don't notice a difference with your classmates and friends who follow another lifestyle. You're both healthy or you both get a flu in the winter or whatever, and it doesn't seem to make such a difference how you live. But as you get older, suddenly it may happen that your tower crumbles and dissolves. And the same thing is with our life expectancy. Usually we see the differences starting around 50, 55 years of age. And then this difference between what type of lifestyle you led throughout your life will start to show. And a people who follow the recommendations of the Adventist Church regarding lifestyle, they usually live longer than those who don't. It depends a little bit on which country you live and if you're a man or a woman, but there is a definite positive factor if you follow the recommendations. Very simple, yeah, we read them. But it can add up to 8 years of life in the case of men living in, for example, California, Holland, Poland. And in women, it's a little bit less, but we have the advantage that our life expectancy is longer usually than for men. So then we're even, even following a good lifestyle. So we see lifestyle appears to work, yeah? And we know from data that only 15% of our life expectancy is actually regulated by our genes. And the rest lies in our hands. And we can make the decision of how well and how long we're going to live. The perfect example for this is twins, monozygotic twins, which share exactly the same genetic material. And in spite of that, they don't usually die in the same day or month or even year. They usually die years apart and having different diseases. So how is that? Theoretically, they should both have the same thing because they have the same genes and die around the same time, but that's not the case. So we see there are other factors. Here we see pictures of monozygotic twins, and alone from the picture, you can see that there must be a factor because one of them looks a little bit older from her appearance. And the difference is smoking in this case. The one that looks a little bit older has smoked a little bit longer than her sister. These two men, very pretty eyes, but one of them looks a little bit older, and that's because he smoked 14 years longer than his brother. And even if you try to have some type of operation to look better and so on, still you can notice who has smoked and who hasn't smoked. So what we do is translate it, and you can actually even sometimes see it, as in the case of smoking and not smoking. And we know that the use of natural remedies requires an amount of care and effort that many are not willing to give. Nature's process of healing and upbuilding is gradual, and to the impatient, it seems slow. But in the end, it will be found that nature, if we let her do her work, does it wisely and well. Those who persevere in obedience to nature's law will reap the reward in health of body and health of mind. That's a promise we have. And maybe we don't have the patience, or we're a little bit doubtful of if it really helps to sacrifice some things to stay healthier. And that's why we want to discover in this workshop how this works exactly, because maybe that will motivate you to make some changes or to decide to keep living like you are. Because when you understand how it works, I think many people are motivated by that. So that's why we're going to talk about epigenetics. And it's a compound word. Genetics, you know, genes, DNA, what you inherit, your genetic code. And if you add the word epi, it means on top of. So it's a layer on top of the genetic information that you inherited. And to have a picture before your eyes, you can just compare it with a computer. You have the hardware, But if you just go to the store and buy the hardware and forget to buy the operating system and the software that you need, your computer won't be of much use for you at home. So you need to install some programs, and ideally it has to be the programs that you really need. You don't want to install something that you don't need. And the same thing is with genes and what happens to us, our lifestyle and our environment. We got the instructions, but we decided how to put them into practice and how good or bad we're going to use them. That's epigenetics. Until now, there are 3 known mechanisms how epigenetics works. I'm sure there are more, we still don't know them. It's a fairly new branch of knowledge. So we've learned a lot the last 15 to 20 years. Before that, we didn't even know about epigenetics. So there are very fascinating things to learn and many more yet to come. The 3 mechanisms have names, which you don't need to remember. I just want to explain it in a very simple way so that you have a clear picture. So what we inherited from our parents is like recipes, a recipe book with instructions on how to make different proteins, which will be our food. But probably none of you has ever cooked all the recipes in a recipe book you have at home, because either you don't have the time, the ingredients, or are not interested in cooking something that's on your cookbook. And the same thing happens in our cells. All the cells have exactly the same 22,000 genes, but none of the cells needs to make everything that's encoded by those 22,000 genes. So we have different possibilities on how to decide which genes are not going to be used. One way would be, and you probably know this, for example, from your hymn book, if you try the hymn and maybe you didn't like it or it's not appropriate for some occasion, so you can make a mark. And you still have the information, it's still in your book, but you want to use it because you've labeled it. And that's what we do with the first mechanism. Just putting something on top of the DNA, which is like saying, we are not going to read and copy this information. Another option would be if it's a very hot day or a hot month, it's summertime, you say, I don't need any recipe, any soup recipes this whole month because it's so hot. So you can put a clip on those pages. The information is still there, but you can't access it to copy it. So as long as you have the clip put in there, you won't be able to cook any soup because you can't copy the recipe. And finally, in order for the recipe book to stay healthy and intact in every cell, the recipes are not read and cooked directly from the book, but are copied into the so-called RNA, which is a copy of the recipe, which is taken to the kitchen where it will be read and it will be cooked. And if something spills on top of the recipe, then it's not bad because you have the original copy still in your book. And the third mechanism, what it can do is it can attach, recognize if there's something similar in the recipe to what you have in this little piece of paper. And once it does that, it's possible to destroy your recipe. So you were able to copy the recipe because you didn't have a clip or hadn't labeled it, but still, if for some reason you decide, oh no, the weather's changed and I'm not going to cook a soup today because now it's gotten warm, then you can still destroy the copy that you have made before or while you are cooking the soup. Those are the 3 basic and known mechanisms of epigenetics. Now we'll go into a little bit into each one and give examples of how this works out in real life and what effect it has. So we'll begin with the methylation. We have our very fine strand of DNA, and we can put something on top to know it's there, but I'm not going to copy it. And this is called methylation because a chemical group is added, which is called a methyl group. And if you add some labels, mostly at the beginning of the recipe, that means for the cell, we're not going to copy this gene and it's not available, it's not going to be used. So it's like you turn it off. In order to make the ink to put the label on top of the DNA, you need nutrients. And the nutrients you need are, for example, folic acid, beta-in, choline, and vitamin B. They are needed to make the compounds that are the, so to say, ink to put this label. And it's also interesting to note that if you drink alcohol, this disturbs the process of putting the correct mark on the correct place. So one of the pathways to break down alcohol, which has to be done after someone drinks alcohol, is shared with a pathway that has to make the ink and put it in the right place. So if I'm drinking alcohol, I'm using this pathway and it's not available for the other side to put the label. So that's why we know that alcohol is not beneficial, because it affects how the software in your cells will be working. And by the way, for like 80, 90 years, it was taught and everyone talked about that a little bit of alcohol was beneficial for our health. That was until the year 2018. In that year, 2 big studies were published, and last year there was another study that was published which showed that no amount of alcohol is good for your health. These are big studies. And by the way, at the end of the presentation, you will have a slide with an address where you can send your email. And if you send me your email address, at the middle of September, I will send you a copy of this presentation. As I am in vacation right now, I won't be able to do it right away, but I promise to send you a copy of the presentation so that you have all the references and all the information if you want to go back. So going back to alcohol, this was a very big study, one of them, which combined, it was a meta-analysis, which combined data from almost 600,000 people who drank from 83 studies, and they could calculate for different diseases and pathologies if you have an increased or a decreased risk if you drink alcohol. And it was shown for some people, maybe for cardiovascular health, you can have a small benefit by drinking a little bit. But for most people, this doesn't apply. And if you then take into consideration all the other pathologies, not just cardiovascular, then you see that it doesn't bring anything, and actually it harms to drink alcohol. So let's go back to methylation. What happens throughout our life? The beginning of our life is a really critical period for setting these marks. There is a lot going on in the first 2 days of life after conception. So not even the woman knows that she's pregnant at that stage, but there's a lot of things going on during the first 2-3 days. And after the 3rd pregnancy week, another round of putting and taking away these marks takes place on the cells that will become one day the cells of the grandchildren. So the woman is now pregnant, But on the second green line that you see that goes down, things are happening in what is going to become the grandchild of that woman. And then the baby is born, and at the beginning of life, everything goes fine. But as we age, the enzymes needed to put the ink, they are not produced in the necessary amounts, and things don't work as well as they should. So that's why we see a decrease of the level of methylation of our labeling in the cells. And that's related to age-related diseases, like, for example, cancer, diabetes, and other diseases. And it's even postulated that some pathologies that are diagnosed when we are 40, 50, 60 years old actually probably could have their beginning during the time when we were an embryo still, or even before. And that's what we want to also talk about today. It's not only your health and your life, what the decisions that you're taking today are also going to influence the life expectancy and the health of your children, and possibly your grandchildren, and even maybe the great-grandchildren. So it's something to think about. Like I mentioned, when we go through life, as we get older, we have less labels when we try to read the whole recipe book. And that's been investigated the last year, and it's possible to look at if 200 different positions in your genome are labeled or not labeled, and put that into a mathematical formula, an algorithm, and calculate how old you are. So actually nowadays it's possible to take any biological sample from someone without knowing that person, without having seen his passport or whatever, and know how old that person is, just by looking at certain positions, if they are labeled or not. Ideally, so the best scenario would be that your passport says you're 50 years old, and when you calculate it, it comes up you're 35 years old. So that means you're biologically younger than you really are. And on the other side, if the calculation says that you're older than your actual passport age, that's bad, because it increases, for example, the chances that you will have a cancer. So the ideal situation is, to stay biologically young as possible. And how we can influence the working of this ink and labeling. Well, I already mentioned through food. Here you see some of the foods that are known to be good for epigenetic processes. But maybe you're wondering, but does it really make a difference? And for that, there is this classical experiment that was carried out around 15 years ago with mice. And mice are usually brown, white, or black, and small, skinny. In this case, you see that one of the mice is yellow, it's a little bit overweight, and I can tell you that that mouse will probably die prematurely because of diabetes or heart disease. How come? Because there's a gene that should be turned on just for a couple of days during the embryonic development of mice, and then it should be labeled and stay turned off for the rest of the mouse life. If that doesn't happen because there's not enough ingredients to make the ink, for example, then the mouse will have this yellow fur color, and it will be overweight and die prematurely. So what they did was they paired yellow females with normal looking males, and half of the group got a supplement during pregnancy of vitamin B12, choline and betaine and these other supplements. And when the pups were born, the majority of the pups born of the supplemented group were normal looking. And that repeated itself for 5 generations until they didn't give them anymore the supplements during pregnancy. And then suddenly, most of the pups were yellow and overweight. So no genetic changes, no mutations or whatever, just being able to influence the gene expression. And you might say, I eat quite well, so I think everything's going fine. But there is one factor that maybe we don't think about very often, and it's the fact that today we're exposed to many chemicals to which our grandparents, for example, weren't even exposed to. So even a baby is born already with many chemicals in his or her body that are man-made. And one of them is the so-called bisphenol A, which is an endocrine disruptor. The chemical formula of bisphenol is similar to estrogen, so it messes up how the cells work and react. And bisphenol A is found in many plastics because it's a compound used to make plastic more malleable and that it will stay in form. In the inner coating of some cans, well, of course, toys and whatever is made out of plastic, not in all plastics. I will show you later which ones. It also, when you have a cavity and it's repaired with this plastic composite, you know, the white looking one, or the same color as your teeth, when this material hardens, then bisphenol A is produced. And after getting a cavity filled, the concentration of bisphenol A in your mouth increases by a factor of 300. And the thing is that very small quantities of bisphenol can already have an effect on the functioning of the cells. Another factor that many people don't know is that on thermo paper, so fax paper, and the receipts that you get when you go buy something, this paper also contains bisphenol. And it's been observed, so some years ago, we didn't even know this, that apparently we absorb more BPA through the skin as when we ingest it. So just touching these receipts, if they have BPA, will have an effect because it will go into our body, especially if then we touch our face or whatever, or mouth with the fingers, then it will be even more. Interestingly, also, it's been shown that if we drink or eat bisphenol, it gets eliminated in a couple of hours from our blood through urine. But if this bisphenol came from the receipt paper, it stays a lot longer. So that's the red dots on the graph in our body, and it takes more time until it's eliminated from our body. So we should be careful about where we store our food, what we do with our teeth, and their receipts, and so on, because there's a lot of information regarding the effect of BPA in our metabolism, in obesity, even in children, in their cognitive development, and so on. So it would be logical to think BPA has an effect on the sexual organs and their functioning. It's a known fact, for example, that sperm concentration has gone down by 50% in the last 40 years in developed countries. which is not such a nice fact, and maybe it's not all due to BPA, but BPA plays a role. And there is also increased chances of breast cancer, prostate cancer, and so on, if you're more exposed to BPA. And in children, it's been shown that, for example, hyperactivity or some social development problems have to do with the concentration the children were exposed to during pregnancy and when they were small. So it's important to think about this and how bisphenol works, through methylation. So on the one hand, it may interact with some receptors and so on, but on the other hand, it also works through epigenetic mechanisms such as methylation. Yeah, it would be nice to have banned from at least the containers where we buy our food or heat our food or whatever. Some countries have banned it. For example, Colombia has banned in the year 2012 BPA from food containers, but the EU has been reluctant. France has better laws, but still there's not a European-wide law regarding this. So you have to take care of, to watch out what you're doing. And like I said, there is different types of plastics. The ones that have this symbol with 1, 2, 4, and 5, they should not contain bisphenol A. And you should be careful with those having the symbols 3, 6, and 7, because either we don't know what they have or they contain bisphenol A. So if you're buying, for example, bottled water, maybe have a look what type of plastic it's been bottled in. Because especially if you're buying your water, for example, and having it in the car in a very hot day, so more BPA is going to be going to the water or to the food if the food or liquid is very cold or very hot. So think about it when you choose where you will keep your food. So that's why I would give some very short recommendations, and of course the list could be longer. Touch only cash receipts that you need. Supposedly in the UE, European Union, it should be safer now, but you never know, and it may take some time until all stores replace our paper. If you go to the dentist and get a treatment, rinse your mouth for at least 30 seconds with water to try to wash out as much BPA as possible from your mouth. And if you can get a BPA-free composite, which is not that usual, and it's not so easy to get, then that would be the best option. But like I said, it's not so easy. If you can, store your food in glass containers and not plastic, especially if you're going to heat it up. So never heat up food in a plastic container. And if the plastic container is very old, then probably it's going to be releasing more BPA. And also check your bottled water or juice or whatever you're drinking, if it's safe or not. Now we're going to move on, or before I move on, I would just add that from the studies we know that things that are altered by BPA in you are probably going to have an effect on your children and grandchildren. So studies with mice and rats and so on have shown that sometimes even you don't see anything in the first generation, and then the second and the third generation have increased risks for different types of pathologies because of the BPA exposure. So now we'll go to another example, and it has to do with exercise. In this case, they asked different men and women to ride a bike, but a stationary bike, and to use only one leg for pedaling. And they took muscle biopsies from both legs at the beginning of the training, and then the participants had to train for 20 minutes, 3 times a week for a couple of weeks, and then they repeated the muscle biopsies. And they could see and show that the amount of readable or not readable genes changed by 900 depending on the exercise. So exercise led to labeling of or taking off of the marks of in total 900 genes. And I want to explain that it's not that you can generalize and say, oh, it's always good to have a lot of labels or to not have any labels. What's important is to have the label in the right gene, in the right cell, at the right time. That's what really counts. But if you're following the 8 remedies, this will happen automatically. You don't have to worry about where is it going to go now and is it going to be correct. Your body and your cells know. God has made us wonderfully. And in this case, not only the leg that was riding the bike benefited from the exercise, the other leg also there was a change in 500 genes. We already talked about in another workshop about depression, and just briefly, exercising will turn on, so it will take off the label of one gene that is needed to add something extra on top of this molecule called quinidine. And if you add this molecule, then it's so big that it can go from your bloodstream to your brain and favor the development of depression. So even if you have stress, and that could be a factor contributing for you to get depressed, if you exercise, you're leveling off the effect of stress. Exercise is also beneficial to prevent or help in the treatment of cancer. So if you exercise regularly and then get cancer, the cancer is going to grow slower, and it probably won't be as big as if you're not exercising. And even if you were not exercising before getting a cancer diagnosis, you will benefit by exercising, even if you start after getting the diagnosis. Well, the things that I explained to now sound logical. You could explain them, so to say, physically. Okay, you eat or drink a compound or maybe have more oxygen because of the exercise, and that's what leads to the changes. But it's also fascinating that things that are not physical themselves also influence the labeling of the genes. And one study that showed this had to do with rats. Rats usually, when they have pups, there's different types of behavior, and there's some rats that they lick their dams and they take care of them and clean them and so on. And when they are hungry, the mother takes a good position and stays peacefully there for whatever time is needed. There are other rats that they don't show much of this behavior, and also are like in a hurry when her pups want to drink milk. So what they did is they got many rats pregnant, and then they looked at the little ones to see what was happening. Some of them were let grow up and have children themselves, and they behaved right the same way their mothers had behaved. Another part of the group was sacrificed while they were still young, and brain biopsies were made, and it was investigated if there were differences in genes that were labeled and turned on or off in the two groups. And actually they found differences. So the question was, well, does it have to do with the behavior of the mother, or maybe it's biological, it's somehow already there? So they repeated the whole thing, and right after they were born, they were interchanged and reared by an adoptive mother. And it turns out that this one, whose mother didn't have this licking and loving behavior, behaved when it had its own pups in a more licking and loving behavior, like the adoptive mother. And also the genes were turned on and off like the adoptive mother and not like the biological mom. So this shows that there are things that you can influence through social interaction, through the type of love and caring manifestations that you experience. And there were, again, about 900 genes that were regulated differently. And the number one, which was the most different, is the so-called glucocorticoid receptor gene. It's expressed in this part of the brain, and it's on the cell surface, and it's important because it kind of regulates how you react to stressful situations. So if you have enough of this receptor, you can fine-tune your reactions to stress better than if you have your gene very labeled, most copies labeled, and so you don't produce as much of this receptor. And that's what was happening in these pups. The ones that don't leak their small ones that much and take time for them to drink, they have a lot of this glucocorticoid receptor gene labeled. So the information's there, but the receptor can't be produced as it should. And that leads to increased cortisol in response to stress, reduced exploration, increased fearfulness, impairment in learning and memory, and reduced maternal behavior in females. Just what we experience in our childhood leaves marks. You can even measure them decades later. For example, in 40 men in Britain that were investigated, blood was taken from them when they were adult, and you could see a difference in the methylation, in the labeling of the genes according to if they had experienced childhood abuse or not. And it's a very sensitive subject, I'm aware. So if you were abused, you didn't choose to be abused. I know that. You may still have some consequences because of it. But that's why I want to encourage you to get help and get treatment if you are feeling guilty, if you're feeling sad, if you have a lot of pain because of what happened to you. Don't carry it alone with you. Get help. The longer you try to resolve it alone without trying to get it out of you, the more impact it will have on the labeling of your genes and how you react to different situations. And that will have an impact in your health. And you're not alone. Maybe we hear a lot that women are, for example, sexually abused more often than men. Yes, about 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual abuse. which can take different forms. It doesn't always have to be penetration. Sexual abuse is more than that. But something that's seldom talked about is that men are also abused. Young boys have suffered abuse, and 1 in 6 men have been abused. So you're not alone, woman, man. If you suffered a situation which you probably haven't talked about with anyone because it's too shameful, because you're hurt, because you think you were guilty, which you were not, it's time to get it out of you so that you can have peace again, and that will repercute in your health. So talk to someone about it and get help. It's possible to heal from that kind of situation, and the sooner you do it, the better for your health. What we experience during childhood, adolescence can be also positive. For example, in mice, there's some mice that carry a mutation that makes them have bad memory. So they're genetically predisposed to forgetting things. So what they did is they put in the cage of these teenage mice for 2 weeks, they put the toys and a running wheel and different interesting things to explore and discover. And after 2 weeks, they took them away. When the mice were reached adult age, they had to do memory tests, and the ones that had these fun things in their cages, these interesting things, they had better memory than the ones that hadn't. Yeah, that's logically. But the interesting thing is that then they had pups, all of them, and the pups from both groups never had this enriched learning environment. In spite of that, those that had as mother or father a mice that had experienced this interesting environment did better on the memory tests. So it also could also be inherited to the children, this positive effect. Yeah, what else has an effect through epigenetics? Addictions. That's why it's so hard to break free from an addiction, because it's not just the feeling of being high or feeling well or whatever. There's changes that take place, especially in your brain, that change the expression of the genes, and that's why you have the carvings and so on, cravings. So we know that almost all types of addiction have an epigenetic effect, and sometimes they even predispose. So smoking, for example, changes things that if you come in contact with cocaine, it's more likely that you will become addicted to cocaine, for example. So now let's move on to the second mechanism before time runs out. It has to do with our DNA, and you know, in each cell nucleus we have, believe it or not, we have a 2-meter long strand. So that's a very long strand of DNA that's found in every cell nucleus. And you have to pack that into this very small space. That's why normally you don't want to have the whole thing open and readable and be able to be copied. That's why in your cookbook, you decide, I'm a muscle cell, I don't need any of the proteins and whatever, neither for synapse. So you put a clip on the muscle cell to all the genes that have to do with synapses, if you don't need them there at that moment. Of course, you need also, to have muscle stimulation and so on, but specific types of synapses. And that's done through a mechanism called histone modification. So we have like little balloons inside of the nucleus, and the DNA wraps around these little balloons. And you can modify the ends of the balloons so that they will pack your DNA tightly or let it loose, depending on how you chemically modify them. So what you learned in school with, chromosomes like little lines, well, that's actually just a couple of minutes when a cell is going to divide. Most of the time, it looks like that in the cell nucleus. So you have like this spread of DNA from each chromosome, and you have to try to pack it tightly so that only what's needed is available at that moment. And that's called or achieved through histone modifications. Again, you have enzymes that do this, and again, food has an influence. Here we see different types of foods, and they are not the only ones, they are just some examples. And we see that there's also an overlap of different fruits and vegetables that are good for DNA methylation and histone modifications, and so on. And eating these types of food will be beneficial for your health. For example, sulforaphane, which is found in broccoli or broccoli sprouts. If you have someone eat broccoli sprouts and take blood samples from them after 3, 6, 24 hours, you will see that the activity of the enzymes that put and take away the clips is modified by having eaten broccoli. So you can actually measure it in blood in humans. If you don't like broccoli, you have the option to meditate. And in this case, the study was not done with a type of meditation that I would recommend, but I am sure that, having your devotion, that praying, that having time with God, I'm sure it has a beneficial effect on gene expression. And in this case, they had voluntaries who spent a whole day relaxing and meditating for a couple of minutes each hour. They took blood samples in the morning and in the evening, and they could see a difference in the activity of the enzymes needed to put the clips and take them away at the right position in the people who meditated and not only relaxed. And also there was a difference in the expression of genes that have to do with inflammatory processes. 2 examples of how histone modifications work. Now let's go to our final mechanism, the microRNAs. And here we see, like I explained at the beginning, that many times it can be that you already copied a recipe, and as long as you have your recipe lying around and it's intact, you will be able to cook that. But it may be that you get a phone call, you're getting, guests are coming over to eat, so you decide to change your menu. So you have to destroy fast the recipes that you were planning to cook and make something else. And you can do that through these microRNAs. They are called micro because they are very small, around 22 letters or bases long, compared to a recipe that usually has around 10,000 letters. So in the genome, we have sections where you don't find any recipes, but in those places you can find these small messages, which can also be copied and processed, and they go out in the cell and they look around. Is there any recipe that has the complementary letters to what I have written? If that's the case, they stick to that recipe and lead to the destruction of the recipe. They don't only work on the cell that produced them, but can be exported to the blood or to other bodily fluids. So they have primarily an effect on the cell that made them, but they can also have an effect on cells or even organisms that are far away. Let's see, for example, what happens if you smoke. If you smoke, the compounds found in the cigarette will lead to a change of the production and the concentration of different types of microRNAs. For example, the one with the number 487, and without asking someone if they smoke or they drink alcohol, you could take blood from them and determine the concentration of different types of microRNAs, and you would know if that person is a smoker or not. That's how powerful it is. But not only smoking, also video playing. And you know, video playing addiction has been classified as a disease by the World Health Organization. So actually nowadays it is a pathology if you're addicted to playing video games. And playing video games leads to changes in the amount of 3 microRNAs that are circulating in your blood sample. So you could actually also find out if someone's addicted to video playing just by looking at how many copies they have of each 3 of these microRNAs. And the thing is that these microRNAs, they play around and affect around 1,200 genes. Because you see, because they are small, suppose that you have a microRNA with letters that spell out apple. So the microRNA apple goes out to the cell, and any recipe that has the word apple can be targeted by this microRNA. So it's not just that one microRNA targets one gene. It's usually one microRNA targets many genes. So when you are addicted to video playing, that will be also making changes not only at your brain level, it may be also leading to changes in your body functions, because it's modifying how much of each gene can be produced as a protein. And if you think about cells, well, everything that we eat, except if you're eating, I don't know, stones or whatever, has been or is a living thing. So you have microRNAs inside of them. There are foods where the microRNAs or the concentration is higher and they are better packed in comparison to others. But in things that we eat, we have microRNAs. And for example, you can test this with people who eat watermelon, or you can take any food and you can have them eat watermelon and then take blood samples at different time points. And you can see how after some time, the microRNA that they ate, which was contained in the watermelon, the concentration in the bloodstream of that person increases. You see, because microRNAs are so small, they survive a lot of things. They're not degraded that fast, and usually they are well packed, especially if they come from animal food sources. We absorb them, and because they are so small, many of the microRNAs from other species have exactly the same sequence as our human microRNAs. That means that they can also affect our human genes and their expression, the amount that can be made of our human products, even if we ate a microarray from a watermelon or from milk or whatever. We see, for example, in breast cancer patients that in healthy people who don't have breast cancer, the concentration in blood of the microRNA that you see there is higher than in those that have non-progressive breast cancer and lower in the cases where it progresses. And what's a good source for this microRNA? Broccoli. And actually they even tested this, so they synthesized this microRNA and in cell cultures of patients, if they give this microRNA, like they mix it to the normal food for the cells, the tumor growth is slowed down if you give more of this microRNA. So it can be even used as a therapy. So I'm not saying you cure cancer by eating broccoli alone, but I'm sure you can prevent a lot of diseases by eating correctly. And of course, you can supplement therapies and so on by eating the right things, exercising, and so on. We know that every body fluid contains microRNAs, like I said, and milk is a wonderful thing because it's a wonderful liquid that has all the necessary nutrients for a newborn to grow very fast. So in milk, we find the microarrays usually packed in like little round things, which are protected. And you can even make cheese, you can pasteurize milk, you can do whatever you want, and many of these microRNAs survive and can be absorbed. The same thing with meat. You can broil meat and the microRNAs survive and can be absorbed and have an effect. Here you see the curves of people drinking different amounts of milk and how you see spikes after some hours of specific milk microRNAs going up after drinking milk and then going slowly down again. So what we eat and drink has an effect, and you could say it's like you were doing a little bit of gene therapy, because actually you are changing the expression of your genes through the microRNAs which are found in your food. Yeah, so just to think about it. Have you ever thought about why gladiators had the strength that they had and the capacities? What did they eat? Can we know that? Well, actually we can, because gladiators were, there is cemeteries that were used only for gladiators, for example, in Greece. And there were excavations done some time ago. They found bones of gladiators, and you can analyze the bone composition and know what the people ate. When they did that, they found out that gladiators didn't eat a lot of meat and things that you would suppose, but were mostly vegetarian, and you could even say vegan. Yeah, so they didn't eat much animal products because they knew that for inflammation and for different processes, animal products are not the best thing. And actually you have some microRNAs in milk that that favor cell growth, because that's the idea of a little baby growing fast. Cells have to divide and grow, but you don't want that if you're an adult. And if you have a little cell somewhere that's going a little bit crazy and wants to divide, you don't want to favor that division by giving it, so to say, this microRNA that works like a fertilizer on that cell division. So just something to think about. And we have the recommendation, or the warning, that as disease in animals increases, the use of milk and eggs will become more and more unsafe. An effort should be made to supply their place with other things that are healthful and inexpensive. The people everywhere should be taught how to cook without milk and eggs, so far as possible, and yet have their food wholesome and good tasting. Yeah, so that's a recommendation. Everyone has to decide for him or herself when you think the time has come, but we should be careful and think about this. We have talked about different natural remedies and how they work. I will talk now about fresh air or living in the countryside. And in this case, don't look for now at the text in green, just look at the right side. So this study was done with adult person who they investigated different sections of their brains and which sections were activated when, or became active when they were activated and so on. And the conclusion of this study was that individuals, and I'm reading now the text on the bottom half, individuals raised in an urban environment showed altered prefrontal activation relative to those raised in rural or town settings. An urban childhood upbringing altered the prefrontal function and interacted with each gene to alter how the genes are expressed. Gene-environment interactions between multiple dopamine genes and urban upbringing suggest that neural effects of developmental environmental exposure could mediate, at least partially, increased risk for psychiatric illness in urban environments via dopamine gene expressed into adulthood. Urban upbringing and urban living, so-called urbanicity, offer benefits from increased productivity and prosperity, higher wages, and increased access to cultural resources. However, urbanicity related to poor mental health increases risk for anxiety and mood disorders, and a doubling of the lifetime prevalence of schizophrenia with an associated population relative risk larger than family history. So where you grow up leaves an imprint on the genes, which shows even on the activation of your brain regions and how your brain reacts to certain things. And this, I don't even know if they're Christian authors of this study, say, it's better if you don't want to have mental problems to grow up in a rural environment. And that reminded me of a quote from Ellen White, who said, "There is not one family in 100 who will be improved physically, mentally, or spiritually by residing in the city. Faith, hope, love, happiness can far better be gained in retired places where there are fields and hills and trees. Take your children away from the sights and sounds of the city, away from the rattle and din of streetcars and things, and their minds will become more healthy. It will be found easier to bring home to their hearts the truth of the Word of God." So if you're planning, what are you going to do with your future, your career? Where are you going to settle as a family when you get married and have children? Have this at the back of your mind. It's better to raise up children in a more rural environment. Sleep is very important. You know that you inherit factors that may predispose you to overweight, but if you sleep enough, then you, again, contrast this effect. So studies with twins show that if they slept 9 or more hours, the effect of the genes was only about 32% versus 70% if they slept less than 7 hours. Light. What type of light are we exposed to? Sunlight or artificial light? And you see, sunlight has all the wavelengths of from blue to ultraviolet, and the other types of lights we're exposed to vary, and most of them have too much of the blue wavelength component, and that messes up with our eyes and the production of melatonin and different hormones that are needed for our body to work properly. So try to reduce your exposition to this blue light and artificial lights and spend more time with natural light. Spirituality, believing in a higher being, Going to church, does it have an effect on your health? Yes, it does. If you go to church regularly, let's say once a week, studies, not done with Adventists, but with other religions where they had people who went weekly or not weekly to church, showed that your risk of dying is reduced by, depending on the study and how long, between 7 and 25% if you go to church regularly. It's nice meeting our brothers and sisters. It's nice being able to sing. It's nice being able to, share with someone when we're not doing okay, to find comfort in God's word. That helps our health. So, and now we're coming to the end, and I want to end up by showing a couple of examples that have to do how our decisions influence our descendants. And one of the also classical studies in this regard was done a couple of years ago using data that was found in books in a region called Ovacalix. Ovacalix was a region that was quite cut off from the rest of the world in the 19th century. So they depended on their, whatever they had to eat was what they had as they harvested. So if the harvest wasn't so plentiful, the next year they didn't have so much to eat. And it's known how much or how big the harvests were. So the investigators wanted to see if there's any relationship between eating more, because you have a more plentiful harvest, and the life expectancy of your descendants. At the beginning, they didn't find any relation until they divided men and their male descendants and women and the female descendants. And they found that if between the 8th and the 12th year of life, that's a period of life where children usually stay the same height, they don't grow that much, so you may think not much is happening. Actually, apparently a lot is happening, because they found that if these young men didn't have a lot to eat because the harvests weren't so good, their male grandchildren lived 6 to 32 years longer than the descendants of boys who had a lot to eat between the 8th and the 12th year of life. And that was in the 19th century. Now think about our generation, how much we have to eat. What type of food do we have available? What is going to happen with our descendants? And this effect had, you can only explain it through epigenetics, which is playing a role. So that's why maybe we are suffering consequences of the transgression of our parents or grandparents. They cannot be censured for their parents' sin. Wherein their parents' habits were wrong, they should change their course and place themselves by correct habits in a better relation to health. So maybe it's not our fault what my grandfather did and how much he ate or whatever, but I can decide what I'm going to do for the well-being of my descendants. And that's the responsibility that each one of us has. Because we see that the last couple of years, you see, like the last hundreds of years, life expectancy has been going up. 100 years ago, 1900, people in Europe usually on average lived like 48 years. Now people live 78 years, 80 years. But the last 3-4 years, the life expectancy predictions for newborns is starting to go down. Why? Medicine is developing, and these calculations were done before Corona. So why is it going down? Could it have something to do with our lifestyle, exercise, chemicals we're exposed to, amount of food we're eating, and what is becoming labeled, in which informations are going to pass on to our children and grandchildren? Yeah, a point to ponder about. But let's finish with a positive example, because God promised that, yeah, whatever the parents did will have an effect up to the third and fourth generation. But he also promised that a positive things, that thousands of generations would benefit from it. Can it really be? Yeah, there's not so much studies in that regard, but there is one fascinating study which was published in the same publication of another thing that you all have heard about, Pavlov experiment with the dog and the bell. So in the same article where Dr. Pavlov talked about the dog and the bell, he also talked about mice. He wanted to teach mice that when they heard a bell ringing, they should look around in their cage, because somewhere there was food that had been hidden. So first the mice didn't understand that. So they heard the bell, but didn't do anything. So they needed about 300 trainings to memorize and understand and learn this. Yeah, so what would you expect would happen in the second generation? How many trainings would they need? I would say 300, because there's no gene for bell, food, go looking for food, whatever. Astonishingly, the second generation mice needed only 100 trainings, the third only 30, and the fourth generation only 10 trainings. Isn't that astonishing? How is that information passed on? There is a way. God made us, he knows it, and he knows what we experience, and our decisions and our lifestyle can have a negative, but also a positive effect on our descendants. So your DNA doesn't make who you are. DNA is not the same as you. It's not your destiny. You have a free will, you have a choice, and you can decide to make the best out of the information that you received. God bless you, and whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do it thinking and glorifying God. God bless all of you and give you the strength to make the changes that you need, or begin something new if you have to, so that you can enjoy a long and plentiful life. I wish you all the best, and like I said, here I will put the screen. You can either copy the address or scan the URL code, and then you can go to this formula, type in your email address, and at the middle of September, I will send you an email with a link where you can download the presentation. I wish you the best. God bless you. And now if you have any questions, we can talk about them. So good luck. It was nice spending this time with you.